Hello everybody. Good morning from Canada. So my name is Hui. I'm glad to coordinate this series on environmental and human health risk assessment. And today we have the lecture given by Professor Larry Swatuk from the University of Waterloo. And he's talking to us about ensuring water security, managing risk in the 21st century. So let's talk a little bit about Professor Swatuk. So he's a professor at the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development. He's as well a research fellow of the Basel School of International Affairs and the Water Institute in Waterloo. He got his BA and MA from the University of Windsor and a PhD from Dalhousie University, and all these institutions are in Canada. He's currently a director of the International Development Program at the University of Waterloo, and the past president of the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. Regarding scientific contributions, so I can find 64 articles that he has published and a large number of books and book chapters. So you can see two of them that I show it here, the two last books that he has just authored, one on water in Southern Africa and another one published this year on water, climate change, and the boomerang effect. So the research interest of Professor Swatuk could be divided into big pillars. The first one is on political science and international relations with a specialization in political economy and foreign policy. He's an expert in the area of sub-Saharan Africa, but as well he have traveled and worked in different locations in Europe, Latin America, and Central Asia. He's working as well on political economy of the environment and how to manage the natural resources. And notably, that you can see in the lecture today is about water. And the last book that you have seen in the previous slide, he worked recently as well on negative consequences of climate change adaptations and mitigation interventions. And he labored a concept about the boomerang effect, and I'm extremely curious to learn more about that. So I just turn the stare to you, Professor Swatuk, and thank you very much again for your kind acceptance. And then I look forward to your lecture.
Right. Thank you so much, Wei. I'll call up my share here. Okay. Play from the start.
Perfect.
Okay. Right. So I'm calling this Ensuring Water Security, Managing Risk in the 21st Century. This is a kind of a compilation of thinking around a subject that I've conducted research on for probably 23 years now, and also have turned this this research into a couple of courses that I teach. One called Water and Security that I teach at Waterloo, but one that I also teach at the University of Western Cape in South Africa, where I'm extraordinary professor in the Institute of Water Studies. And I also have a second course called Water, Human Security and Development, which is an issues-based course that complements the Water and Security course at the University of Waterloo. So many of the slides that you're going to see here, there's many slides, but most of them are pictures. What you're going to see here is my current thinking about one particular aspect of risk management and risk assessment, and that is around perception. How do we know we're at risk? How do we understand hazards? And then what do we do about it in relation to the kinds of questions that we ask, the puzzles that we put together in the hope that we'll achieve some kind of security, meaning sustainable risk management. So this isn't everything about this subject. It's just an extract because I thought I would try to complement what the previous four speakers talked about, and so hidden within the slides, but not oftentimes directly noted by me, and maybe would be interesting for questions, is some of the key points that were brought up earlier. So, for example, Professor Escher, Beate Escher, mentioned that she quoted Paracelsus saying, "The dose makes the poison." And that, I think that's very important for us in terms of water security, because we're always trying to figure out what is the threshold, how far, and in Earth systems science, we're all, and in relation to human interests and needs, we're always trying to push the envelope a little bit. Can we go a little further, a little further? How far can we go? And so, it's this kind of push for particular interests, but then a pushback from Earth systems, but also scientists and others who have perhaps a different take on the robustness of a system and its ability to handle whatever kind of pressures are on it. Dr. Casey Bartram spent a lot of time talking about governance and the importance of participation in interventions designed to ameliorate problems or to build back better, for example, systems. A notable quote from her was, "Nothing about us without us." And I think what you're going to hear today is a lot of talk about modeling and ideas about sustainability that is expert driven. And too often there are no people who are impacted directly by these decisions. In fact, never mind the risk, but the risks that attenuates from the decisions taken in the rooms. And so I think the governance question is extremely important. Dr. Van Vesten talked much about models, and he showed us great innovations in modeling. And as I'm going to talk about here, what we should also know is that models are just as good as the data that's gathered. Your model may be beautiful, but the data may be rather flimsy. So models, reflect data, but data also reflects the questions that we ask. And if we ask questions in a particular way, we might go down a different pathway than had we asked a different question and put resources in that direction. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that as we go along. And then lastly, Professor Oliver's encouragement for us to do due diligence through things like environmental impact assessments. I lived in Botswana for 11 years. I worked in Africa for 14 years before I came to North America. And I worked on lots of social impact assessments and environmental impact assessments. And I think that what Professor Oliver's main point there was that we should be willing to expect unanticipated outcomes. That in fact, in one of the cases he presented, that of the coal mine, I mean, who in the 21st century is in support of draining a wetland in support of a coal mine? And yet, he provided information there that suggested that this was a good thing to do or an appropriate thing to do in this particular case. So, so we need to be able to recognize that we come to a risk assessment with particular perspectives in mind, and so oftentimes the risk perception is a function of our perception, but what we also choose to do about it is a function of our perspectives, and which oftentimes reflect our interests. Okay, this is a picture of my wife, Dr. Corinne Cash, outside of our house in Ontario. And what I like about this picture is this shows something very important about risk management in terms of water supply in urban settings, and that is in Canada we have free winter storage. Right? We don't worry about where the water runs and where it goes, and this stands in direct contrast to where we used to live in Botswana in the Okavango Delta. And this is a photo taken from my backyard in Maun. This is an overflow part of the Tamalakani River that seasonally would flood, but for half the year it looked like this. So that's the same area, right? So, and that's a hippo pool in the background. So that's a perennial piece of water that never dries up completely. But when you compare it to that, this is a interesting dynamic that is quite different from this. And so I think, when I moved back to Canada in 2007, I learned to see Canada with new eyes. This is a picture of my little house that we had in Botswana. This is where I lived at the foot of the Okavango Delta. You see there, it's an endorheic river system with that drains inland. And so you see Maun, the tiny little dot there on the map, is where I lived, and those are some of my neighbors. And what I learned about water in that kind of a system, where that river is what you can call a linear oasis. So in a relatively dry area, that is a seasonally available resource, surface water seasonally available resource, year-round groundwater available resource that draws many different actors to it, who have quite different interests. So not only do you need water for yourself, for your household, and so on, but you compete not only with your neighbors, human neighbors, but also with the cows and the marabou storks that you see in the bottom middle photo in the background. Those white dots, those are marabou storks. They're a protected species, and they have a right to the water too. So when you're doing, when you're trying to do an analysis of how much water is enough, you have to ask complicated questions about who has a right to the water and for what. In a place where there are about 240,000 elephants in this part of the southern Africa that includes Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, you often compete with very big neighbors and very angry neighbors like the hippos. But also you have to consider the tourists who need the water. You can see the lined up there as water in another form. But they too are users, and it's a non-consumptive use. So it's very complicated to think about how you manage that system. And it looks quite different than a system with my free winter storage. And this is me standing out front of my house after I've shoveled, we're in the snow belt here, where we tend to get quite a bit of water. I'm not sure why that X went on the screen, but that's okay. Okay, so again, I wanted to tell you that story to situate myself in the context of this lecture. What I'm saying here is that perception matters. How you see the world depends on where you sit. How you think about risk, especially in relation to water, depends very much on a mix of the science, the empirical, but also how you feel about your own security in relation to the actual availability of the resource. Now, what we often hear is this, still quoted so often, is this quote from Ishmael Sarah Geldin, that wars of the 21st century will be over water. And this is a photo I've taken from the internet that shows the decimation in Syria. In my view, this is definitely not a water war. So there's a kind of a narrative around insecurity that we are facing in relation to water, which gives us a heightened sense of risk. And I think that this is somehow misplaced, and I'm going to try to explain to you why that is, and to try to give you some tools to encourage you to be able to think differently about risk. In fact, when we look at the data around conflict, around water conflict, what we see is that there's not only conflict, but there's a great deal of cooperation. And quoting David Gray here, back when he worked at the World Bank, it's very clear that there's a lot of stress around shared river basins, especially those shared between states. But at the same time, what we do see, what the empirical data shows, is that we tend to conflict, but also cooperate on the very same river basins. And so, so we have to ask ourselves, what is driving our perception of this sense that we are running out of water and we're facing heightened risks? This is a photo of me running a workshop in Tajikistan, in Dushanbe in Tajikistan. I do conflict resolution and negotiation workshop trainings on water resources. And all of my slides were translated into Russian. And this is a picture of Mark Twain. And the saying there, written, translated in Russian, says, whiskey is for drinking. Maybe they put vodka, I don't know. Whiskey is for drinking, and water is for fighting over. And that's a fact. Okay, it's true. But we have to recognize that fighting comes in many different shapes, sizes, and forms. And oftentimes conflict is a precursor to a cooperation. And that often gets lost in the narrative, that in fact, the shooting wars are rare, if ever. And the fact that we cooperate, often even within ungauged basins where we don't have absolute understanding of either the surface or the groundwater systems in place, we still somehow manage to cooperate on sharing these resources. Nevertheless, here are two typical examples of recent thinking about conflict in relation not just to water, but in relation to climate change. The one on the top right of the screen is from Peter Glick. He runs the Pacific Institute in Oakland, California. And in that, he in fact tries to make the case that what we are seeing here is in Syria, the photo I showed you of the decimation in Syria a couple of slides ago, is that it is a climate conflict. And that in line with this kind of thinking, Jeffrey Mazzo wrote a paper, an Adelphi paper, called Climate Conflict, How Global Warming Threatens Security and What to Do About It, in which chapter 3 argues that Darfur is the first modern climate change conflict. But if you read the chapter, he actually says, well, but there are other factors that led to the conflict. So I'm trying to address through this short lecture the persistence of the sense that we're running out of water and we're going to fight over it, and which gives us a sense of heightened risk, which may lead us down a pathway toward decisions that we should perhaps not take, and away from ones that we should take. And I'll give you an example here. So this is shortly following the world financial crisis in 2008, the World Economic Forum, in its annual risk report, focused on water and put together this book called Water Security, the Water, Food, Energy, Climate Nexus. And in that book, they try to make the argument that water is kind of the gossamer that holds everything else together, because water is in everything, and that if it's poorly managed, this will impact not only water security, but also food security, energy security, and also in the context of climate change and increasing uncertainty, that we should therefore try to figure out, not only where the water is and what it's for, but how it relates to human interests in other sectors, such as food or agricultural production, because cotton is not a food, and we use a lot of water for things that are not non-edible in agriculture, but also energy and so on. I've been engaging with this conversation since its inception. In the bottom right there, I see a co-edited a book with my spouse called Water, Energy, Food, and People Across the Global South. Because our argument in this book is that what's missing from the water security discourse and the risk analysis is actually the people who will be affected by these decisions. That this is an elite level decision-making setup, and that rarely do we sit down with the people, as Casey Bartram said in the second lecture. Rarely do we sit down with the people and talk to them about their own needs. More recently, I'm engaged in the water, climate change, and the boomerang effect. That's a book we've just put out, but I have a long-term research project trying to work and to build a decision support tool that will assist decision makers to make better decisions, so that they can see the people, for example, see the consequences of the particular decisions that they're going to take. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about what in light of the narrative around decreasing supplies and increasing risk, what the World Economic Forum said. So the World Economic Forum gathered together a bunch of experts. So this is expert opinion. It's not based on any empirics, but it's a sense of where we are in the world across 5 categories of risk, of hazard, you know, where 5 categories where particular hazards may concentrate: economic, environmental, geopolitical, societal, and technical. And here I've extracted the societal and the environmental to show you where water fits or features in this. What we've got here, you see in their weighting, because there's a network kind of a graphic coming up, is the bigger the circle, the more critical the risk factor in global security, for example. So if you look here at environmental risks, where's my mouse? Whoops. Okay, I can't. Oh, here's my mouse. So you see here in the middle, land and waterway use mismanagement. So global experts brought together believe that the impact and likelihood of environmental risk accruing from land and water use mismanagement is quite significant. More significant is this a belief in water supply crisis, right? So related to this, of course, is, okay, so supply is an important term used here, because what we're really interested in is what is the basis for this crisis, and the basis for this crisis is a belief in increasing scarcity, and therefore to manage the risk we have to manage scarcity somehow. Here's the complicated diagram, but the interesting things here, the nodal points here, the most important environmental one is seen to be climate change, greenhouse gas. But if you follow water supply crisis, it connects to here. The land and water mismanagement, they connect all across the way. And so the argument that the World Economic Forum people were trying to make is that this is an integrated system. We can't just have sectoral approaches. We have to look at water, energy, food, and more lately, water, energy, food, and ecosystems nexus to try to assess the true nature of risks that we face. So what do we do? That's a good question. Well, as a social scientist myself, who has worked for decades with physical natural scientists, the natural thing that we do is to get organized. And I always like this quotation that you can't manage what you can't measure. And I think that both Doctors Oliver and Van Vesten showed us many different ways to aggregate data to help us understand what is the nature of the hazard, what is our risk in relation to how vulnerable are we, and so on and so forth. All right, so you have to get organized. And in order to ask an appropriate question, we need concepts. We need to be able to have clear definitions of these concepts, and then moving from there, as we saw in the previous slide, these concepts like environmental risk may break down into categories, and in order to understand these categories and the hazard they pose, we have to establish criteria. So in my boomerang effect project, this is exactly what we're doing. If we're saying, that this decision will negatively impact people, what is a proxy variable to help us show that one of these consequences is related to the ecosystem? Would it be hectares deforested, for example, by a particular change, or change in the water table? Like, we need some kind of criteria in order to assess the hazard, and I think that Professor Van Vesten was very good at that. And then, of course, we need to benchmark. Like, where do we set the bar? Water quality in Canada, we have a water quality. We don't have legally mandated water quality rules. We have suggestions, which I find quite interesting. At least we have the criterion, we've set the benchmarks, but I would think in relation to water quality and how important it is it not equally important, therefore, to put into legislation that should water move in an undesired direction, that there will be consequences, that someone is accountable for this. And then, of course, once we've set benchmarks, we need to model, we need to determine methods, and so on and so forth. All right, let's start with the definition of water security. Our definition I've taken here, I like this one, is from Van Hofwegen in 2008. It's from a paper that he wrote for a conference that we attended at the IIE in Delft. And most important in this, there are two really important factors in this. I'm not going to read the definition. You can read it for yourself. But I like two facts in particular. One is that he says that water security is the perception of having the possibility of enough water. The perception, okay? So how we feel about it matters as much in terms of our tolerance of conditions. Do we feel at risk? Do we perceive ourselves to be okay? And I would argue that in the Canadian context, because we're surrounded by water, I look outside my window here and I see a lot of free storage. So we seem to be very lackadaisical about our understanding of the risks that are actually facing us. And the second point is that it's very complicated. So, to assure that we have enough water for all our purposes, there are environmental, financial, economic, social costs to this, and that we have a lot of different actors involved who have different interests in the value of the water and what we think we should do about it. And then there are other definitions. So, there's no standard definition. I've just pulled these out from a couple of other places. The Global Water Partnership definition at the top is largely regarded as the global standard definition. But I like the one at the bottom from Karen Baker, who used to be at the University of British Columbia, but she's now in London, England, where she and her group defined water security as sustainable access on a watershed basis. Now, this is very interesting to me because all the other definitions don't say that. But here she's introducing the notion that in order for us to manage risk and ensure security, that we should actually use the basin as the foundation, the benchmark against which we will then be able to understand flows, not just physical flows of water, but virtual flows of water. Water coming in the form of rice, water coming in the form of fruits and vegetables from other parts of the world. So it would help, if we had a watershed focus, it would allow us to then assess how far beyond a natural barrier we are by importing water inside of the basin. And I'll come back to this point in a few minutes. Then, of course, where we go from there is there's many indicators, right? So we've got definitions, we've got subcategories. There are many different ways of approaching this topic to try to figure out how secure are we, where are the risks coming from, and so on and so forth. And then there are different kinds of frameworks that are out there. This is adapted from Baker's group in 2003. But you see there, you have a lot of these kinds of models that are circular in nature, with an assessment. You look at, where you think the stresses are. You try to establish tools to give us as close as possible to a empirical understanding of where we are in relation to our perceptions. And then we have to establish some kind of action-oriented agenda in order to move. We need laws, we need institutions, and so on. We need different kinds of guidelines. And then, of course, we need to monitor and evaluate our approaches and revise and so on and go on around and around. You can find, if you just Google any kind of if you just do water, risk assessment, so many models come up. They're very standard. But okay, fair enough. So we've got a definition, we've got we've got concepts, definitions, categories, measures, and so on. But that doesn't answer the fact that doesn't help us get past the fact that water is not an ordinary good. And this is I love this article from one of my mentors, Hoop Savanai, who's a professor, just recently retired professor at TU Delft, who wrote this article in Physics and Chemistry of the Earth in 2002, where he highlights how water is not like other resources. It's essential. It's non-substitutable. It's scarce, but it's everywhere. It comes, in a very, we might have the same amount of water falling in two different parts of one country or one region, but they may fall at equal amounts over a year, but they may fall in completely different ways. One slowly over time, the other one might come in like a monsoon for some few hours and then be gone for the rest of the year. So, so water is very complicated. And you can see here it's a public good, it's location bound, it has high mobilization costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as we're moving toward a risk assessment, you end up with something like this. And I actually like this, and it's actually quite intelligible if you take the time to look at it and break it down and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, what happens is that you can't get paralyzed by the complexity, right? Somehow we have, the simple fact is everybody needs water. As individuals, it's non-substitutable. Water is in everything. It drives all of our systems, natural systems and human built systems. Water is at the heart of wealth creation. So we can't get paralyzed by complexity. We have to take decisions. We have to be willing to take decisions. How do we take those decisions? And so what I'm going to say to you here, this is basically the second part of my lecture, that discourse matters. And I like this picture because this is a picture of in Etosha National Park in Namibia, and you see here elephants are playing at a water hole. What you don't see is in the background there are a zebra and wildebeest and giraffe and all other manner of animal waiting their turn. And so, like the World Economic Forum coming together and setting agendas for what should be done around water, energy, and food, what often happens is that, who has the most power sets the agenda. Who gets to ask the questions? Who has is oftentimes who has the money. So a question I would have for Professor Oliver regarding the coal mine, I've worked on lots of impact assessments, and rare is it that when you tell the people who paid for the assessment that they can't do what they want to do. So, so these are really important questions that we have to be critical in reflecting on, because having enough water is non-negotiable. We have to have it, and therefore, since everybody needs it, we therefore have to ask the right questions about what are the threats we face, how vulnerable are we, who are we, so that everybody has some water that is adequate for their particular needs. So what I'm going to show you here now is how there's a particular kind of discourse that drives us down a pathway that narrows our decision range. It heightens our sense of risk, but narrow and by giving us a sense of exaggerated threat, driven by, I would argue, particular interest groups, that it sets us down a pathway that may be heightening the risk rather than lessening the risk in relation to having enough water. Okay, so let me focus on the climate change narrative. And the climate change narrative runs something like this, that climate change is leading to increased variability in water supply. So there are more droughts, more floods, the intensity is greater. So we have this heightened frequency of extreme events. Now, if you add that to increased population, and then you add that to increased consumption with things like everybody moving to Western diets, growing middle classes in China and India, this equals heightened vulnerability and decreased water security through pressures to both supply, absolute physical scarcity, and demand, human-induced scarcity. So our desires are changing and making higher demands on water. So that's the dominant narrative. I'm not saying that I agree with this, but this is what you read every day. You see it in the paper every day, and you find it in the papers that I showed you above by Mazur and Glick, for example. And so therefore, what becomes our usual answer? Our usual answer to scarcity and increasing scarcity is to capture that resource before it runs away, and that is dam building, and there's a massive increase in dam building worldwide. I'm not anti-dam by any means. I've seen some beautiful dams that I'm completely in support of, and I've seen some ridiculous dams that had no business being built in the first place. But there are consequences if we put all our eggs in this one basket. You know, if we put it into the mega dam, we know that the Three Gorges Dam along the Yangtze River is a mega dam, but it's not the only example. I've got 4 other examples here. I'm not going to tell you which dams these are. I leave it for you who are participating to, maybe we could have, if we turn this into a MOOC, it could be a small test. What are these 4 dams? But the central point is that we've put so much emphasis on capturing the resource, damming the rivers, holding back the blue water, the surface supply, as our means of security, that oftentimes we get ourselves into problematic situation. And of course, most of you who have tuned into this are quite familiar with the Cape Town crisis that was averted because the rains came at the end of the day. But part of that crisis was fostered by putting all your eggs in the dam basket. And that's DAM, a dam basket. And you can see here the many dams that have been built around the city of Cape Town as a buffer against water insecurity, to manage the risk of drought, and also to manage the risk of flood and so on, to hold those waters back and to have them year round. But it doesn't matter how many dams you build. If the rain doesn't come, the dam doesn't matter, right? So, so we need to think differently about how we approach, managing scarcity as a risk moving forward. So let's rethink it. And I want to take us back to my backyard. Here's my backyard where I used to live in Maun. But this is that same physical space, right? And I think that what I'm trying to say here is that scarcity is not a uniform thing. Water is highly local. And so we need to think about different approaches, different ways of thinking in order to manage that that risk. Okay, let me walk you through the orthodox narrative. Okay, so the orthodox narrative around scarcity goes something like this: fresh water is finite and vulnerable. This is the hydrologic cycle. That water is a flow. I like this from Shiklomanov. That shows that there is a lot of water in the world. All right, a huge amount of water in the world. And also that it comes back, right? It's a cycle, right? So a bit of a challenge to the notion that we're running out is the fact that, yes, water may be scarce, but it is scarce relative to human needs, existing human needs. And actually, there's actually quite a lot of it. And perhaps we need to reflect on the fact that you can't run out of something that returns again and again forever. Nevertheless, we get this kind of image, right? So we're told that water is finite and scarce and precious because of this kind of imaging, right? So you see the little green dot there, that of all the water in the world, only 2.5% is fresh water, of which only 0.3% is accessible to humanity as blue surface and groundwater. It gives you a sense of danger, right? That this is something that we should really worry about. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't worry about it, but I'm also saying that actually there's quite a lot of water. Now, compounding this is the argument that we're using more. So here's a picture of world water use over time. It's going up, you can see dramatically. The important thing here to note is is that 60% of global water use is in agriculture. But it's going up over time. You can see mostly from around the post-war World War II period. And then we juxtapose this oftentimes with the world population development, and look, you see world population is going up about the same time as world water use is going up. Industrialized countries are, flattening out here. So most of the growth is in the global south. And so if you take the notion that water is scarce and finite, and that we're using more of it, and population is going up, and population is primarily going up in the global south, then the logical conclusion you're going to make is that the world water problem is due to there's too many people in the global south. And that is, in my view, completely wrong. And we can have a discussion about that, because if you look at things differently, all right, this is a world consumption cartogram. Water is in everything, as I said. And if you look at this, I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but the cartogram basically shows the ecological deficit about how a particular country, relative to its normal Mercator size, is distorted by the amount of resources it uses from around the planet. And you can see the bloated Japan, the bloated Europe, the bloated United States, and the shrunken South America and Africa. A really important point here is to note that, yes, world water use is going up. Yes, populations are going up, but the consumption of water is largely going to the first world. It's going to the global north. Water is in what we consume, and consumption is primarily a function of the global north. Now, of course, as China and India move along those patterns, okay, there are problems, and there are very real problems with water supply in China and India, because they are replicating the mistakes of the past. That's another conversation. But what I'm trying to challenge here at the moment is this notion that population in the global south accounts for the world, this perceived crisis. It doesn't. It's our consumption patterns. If you're interested in the SDGs, to me, the most important SDG is SDG 12, production and consumption. Unless we confront that, the risks we face are going to worsen. Okay, now let's look at world freshwater supplies. I'm going to give you another way of thinking about vulnerability. Okay, so I want you to concentrate on Central Africa here, and you can see here in sufficient quantities, right, that on average humans need 1,700 cubic meters per capita per year. But you can see here in the Central Congo Basin that they're well over 10,000 cubic meters per capita. This would suggest that everything is fine there. If you look at rainfall across that part of Africa, there's a lot of rainfall. If you look at groundwater supplies, part of that of Africa, there's a lot of groundwater. But if you then look at the national water footprint of countries in that basin, it's very low, right? So it's around between 600 and 800. You look at the industrial world up here, United States, Canada, we're, massive water footprint. So a well-endowed part of the world has a very low water footprint. Even worse, the people here have no access to safe drinking water. So how is it possible that you could have all the water you need, but people don't have enough water for your basic amount of water that you need to drink, your household water in any given year? How is that possible? Well, the International Water Management Institute argues that it's incomplete hydraulic missions, arguing that this part of the world here in Africa, parts of Asia, you can see here, have economic scarcity. They don't have physical water scarcity. They have economic scarcity, meaning that there hasn't been enough water captured for human needs. Okay, maybe. But my argument is that, that water has been captured and is used in particular ways that privilege some people and don't privilege others. It makes some people more secure and some people very vulnerable. And here's a perfect example: that water scarce regions of the world. So that part of the world in Central Africa where people do not have enough water for their domestic needs is actually a net exporter of virtual water. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a net exporter of virtual water? It means that you grow tea. It means that you grow cocoa. It means that you grow coffee. It means that you grow citrus fruits, bananas, and so on, for export, right? Ali Mazrui called African economies, and you could extend this across much of the tropics, as beverage economies. That these economies are growing the commodities that go into beverages that the global north consumes, right? When I'm in Ghana, my friends laugh. They say, look, we're surrounded by coffee. Nobody here drinks coffee. And then my Ghanaian friends in Canada say, look, I'm in Canada. Everybody drinks coffee, but you don't grow coffee. You know, this is an interesting fact because this suggests to me that water has been captured. Water is being used. Water is being, used productively, but it's being used in a particular way for particular reasons that privilege particular people, that strengthen the position of some people and weaken the position of other people. It doesn't address the interests of the less than 1 ton per hectare productive small farmer, for example. And I was just at the 3rd Zambezi River Basin Stakeholder Forum where I said to the experts in the room, there's no farmers here. Where's the 1 ton per hectare farmer in this room? People are taking decisions about water security and the risks they face based on criteria around big cash cropping exercises, mining, cities, and so on. Whereas the most vulnerable people, the people most at risk, aren't even in the room to have the conversation. All right, a couple more slides and then I'll stop. I want to also give you a different way to think about urban water crises as a function of scarcity. So oftentimes we hear we're running out of water, and then we have pictures of cities across the global south where people are queued up for water all over the place. There's adverts for NGOs that want to come and drill you a well, and so on and so forth. And this is a picture of Alexandra Township inside of Johannesburg. So my point here is that the scarcity is in this particular part of this city is real. The water scarcity is real. Is it due to physical water scarcity? No, it's not. This is what Lila Mehta called years ago manufactured social scarcity. That all around this township in the middle of the sprawling greater Johannesburg are wealthy suburbs. People have all the water they need. They have lots of swimming pools. They have more than they could use. A little further down the watershed, you've got all kinds of farming. You've got mining, right? So it's not a shortage per se of an absence of physical water. It's the fact that the supply has not reached people who are most in need for whatever reason. Okay, so that's a different conversation. But the risk is not of the city running out. That's not the risk. The risk is rather that the way the systems have been built and the way that people have captured the water for their particular interests makes some people more vulnerable than others. And the crisis the crisis narrative, the climate change crisis narrative, makes those who have enough water want to hang on to it and not share it. And so that narrative is making people blind to the many ways that you could actually improve the water that you have and the ability of people to access that water, right? So urban water problems, as I just said, are a function of manufactured social scarcity. Urban water is small water, okay? If you see below there, I say households need between 18 and 800 cubic meters per person per year. It's not much, especially when you look at our human need is between 600 and 1800 cubic meters per person per year. Why the big discrepancy? How can we have such a wide gap? Well, most of the water we need is in our food, and that's an interesting conversation that we could have. So urban water is small water. We don't need a lot. It doesn't take much water to satisfy everybody's urban needs. The challenge, of course, is that it's small water, but it's required 24/7 of a certain quantity. So it costs and quality. So it costs money. And so it's a part of a broad conversation that needs to be had about how much is enough and how do we achieve that. Now, the systems we have in place, I'm going to show you in where I am in Southern Ontario. We cluster around the resource. These are groundwater offtake points around the Great Lakes, right? So we flood into places, right? And it's not so much that the fact that we're moving in as individuals and the numbers are creating the risk of scarcity, but it's rather the way we build, right? It's the urban landscape. It's the hard surfaces. It's the paving of everything. That this is Toronto last year. This is a flash flood following really quite a normal rainstorm. That the systems that we've put in place, the urban systems that we are replicating around the world, are heightening risk, right? So it's not climate change making greater floods and greater droughts, and climate change will be a factor, but we are our own worst enemies, and if we put it up to what can we do. We can't. How do we deal when Mother Nature is changing? The facts are actually we are the biggest threat to ourselves, and we have to shift our thinking. And so there's wonderful thinking out there around sponge cities, for example. So urban design can make us more water secure. We can have less water when we don't want it, and we can have more water when we do want it through better design. Right? It's not a function of physical scarcity. It's a function of how we've manufactured the problem through our cycles of dependency around what we think is what a city should look like, and so on and so forth. Okay, last two slides here. My last challenge is to think about food security. So in the WEF nexus, water, energy, and food. When you look at the savanna regions, this is in Senegal, this picture. You see this is the dry season, and oftentimes people look at this and say, oh my God, there's no water. But the trees tell a story. The trees tell you that there's more than enough water, right? That those trees are tapping a groundwater table that's not too deep, and that there is, water, and it comes at some point in time. It's just not coming at this particular point in time. And what you can find across Senegal is a lot of creative water management that shows that you can actually grow a lot of food. That in dry savannas you can get as much, 600 to 800 millimeters of water a year, more than enough to grow crops. But you have to manage the land. You have to manage the soil. You can tap local groundwater. You can have small check dams, not the Yangtze, the Three Gorges Dam, but small one farm, one dams. There's ways to see the opportunities, right? We can't always see through a Western lens. Like where my wife works in Nova Scotia, there are 300 precipitation days a year, 300, right? It falls in a flat hydrograph all across the year in different forms, rain, fog, sleet, snow, and so on. That is completely different than how it falls here in Senegal. It's about the same amount of water, but in Senegal you have two distinct seasons: one where the rain comes and one where it's dry. This does not mean that you can't grow food. This does not mean that you are water insecure. It means that you have to embrace the challenges around the variability, the seasonal variability that is natural to that system. You have to set a risk management strategy that is specific to that location and those interests. Now, of course, I haven't talked about governance and whose interests matter and so on and so forth, but these are some tools to try to help you to see beyond that dominant narrative, right? And so, what I've been talking here about is vapor shift or more crop per drop. When the rain falls, rather than have it evaporate straight back, to use some creative kind of land management to encourage infiltration so you can access that groundwater at some point. And you can see that there's more water available than you thought there was. You may be more water secure. There may be less risk than you thought. You may be less vulnerable than you thought if you take some basic steps that talk to your great grandparents. They, in the savannas, rather than the expert who, like me, who comes from the Western world. All right, last slide. So are you willing to risk a risk assessment? In light of what I've talked about, based on the complexity of the setting, based on notions of scarcity, dominant discourses around scarcity, but different ways of thinking about scarcity, around population, production, human settlement. I've tried to give you different tools to show you that risk analysis is a function of perception. It's a function of interests. It's a function of particular framings and discourses, so that how we think about our vulnerability is often a reflection of the tools we bring to bear, and those tools reflect a particular kind of standard, oftentimes set somewhere else. And I think that what we, at the end of the day, need to do is we need to step back, try to ask better questions about not just the risk, but about the tools themselves, and don't be afraid to undertake a risk assessment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Swatuk, for this very interesting talk. And then actually that triggered some thinking. So we just got right away some question. So from Jacob, and his question is, what are your thoughts on Nestle control on a lot of available drinking water in Canada? How do we restore water security to those who have been taken advantage since the birth of our nations? So he's talking about First Nations.
Yes. That's very interesting. Thank you for that question. Last week when I was in Ottawa at the brainstorming session on Canadian water policy, we actually had two chiefs from different nations in Ontario. I like the way they talked about the three governments in Canada. The three governments: the federal governments, the provincial governments, and the First Nations. And I think that we're moving in a direction to have Canada. We're making strides in a direction of a better conversation. I think this is. Somebody asked the question of Dr. Bertram the other day. Also, a similar kind of question about participation and how you get the right people at the table and so on and so forth. I don't have a specific answer for that, right? But what I do think, though, is that in order for us to get past boil water advisories, to get past blaming, in some ways what we do is we blame the victim. We see the First Nations, we being I'm a white Caucasian male of privilege living in southern Ontario, functioning primarily in a first world governance setting. Rather than seeing the First Nations question as a sectoral issue to be dealt with by us, we have to turn that table around and actually see this as somehow mutually, as a conversation between mutually empowered and equitably endowed in terms of knowledge peoples, rather than sort of some victims that need to be helped by us. So, it's not a very good answer, but because it's more about process. It's not about outcomes. It's more about process. We have these things moving in that direction, but I think that there's always enough money for another gold mine, Northwest Territories. Always enough money for that, right? So don't tell me that there's not enough money for a borehole and some kind of sustainable water supply among First Nations peoples, right? That exposes interests at play, and political interests, but also economic interests. So there's no reason for this. I think we need to set a table in a particular way to have a meaningful conversation about that. And I honestly think that this brainstorming session that's underway is set by Zafir Adil in Simon Fraser University and our colleagues at Ryerson University are moving in that direction. Okay, I apologize for a wishy-washy answer. I've sort of backpedaled away from specifics, but I believe it's about process. It's about will. We always talk about political will. But I believe there's a coalition of interest around here that should be able to push the politics in a direction that is more productive than the very disappointing outcomes we've got at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I just wonder if... Yeah.
I have a question for you, Professor Swatuk. I live on what you might call a typical Ontario farm, small farm, within about 2 kilometers of decent-sized lake. Yet we routinely in this area have groundwater shortages in the summertime that lead to basically people not having any supply. They have to import water, sort of thing. So a couple of questions. First of all, that's almost certainly related to very localized extraction processes and one farm using a resource to a greater extent than other farms. And I'm wondering how you would suggest, from a sort of political perspective, you deal with those sort of micro situations. But secondly, on a sort of larger scale, would you advocate us trying to price in the cost of water into our food supplies?
Well, great questions. Thanks for those. I've been having a long conversation about pricing. Let me start with the pricing question. Given the amount of water that is required to grow our food, the order of magnitude used by farmers relative to, say, what goes into my now cold cup of coffee here, is there's no comparison. So it's not, you'll never get. So there has to be a different pricing. I think pricing is the way to go. I mean, it might not be a popular thing to say, but rain falls from the sky for free and pipes cost money. So at minimum, the operation and maintenance of these systems, if it's a farming system, that needs to be paid for. If it's a groundwater system of some kind, or it's a pipeline system, that needs to be paid for. There's no doubt about it. I've seen a lot of different methods of deciding on payment. So there's a very interesting example from South Africa at the moment where farmers are being charged, they're being charged something, okay, and the price. I'm not going to tell you the price. The price is far below the value of that water. But the logic behind the pricing by the regulators is that they want to make sure that the farmers will pay. And at least that way, that will create a constant revenue stream that will allow them to plan around having X amount of revenue at a particular, in any particular year. So they don't know what the payment threshold is. Like if you increase it by 10%, I think they could increase it by a factor of 100% easily to get somewhere near the true cost. But anyway, so yes, I think pricing should be involved. Pricing pricing will be reflected whether you like it or not in our food. So so I don't think it's necessarily that we have to deal with food pricing and so on. I think paying for the water will therefore straight away translate into whatever that production is, assuming that the water is used to grow food and not some kind of other crop. So it'll translate into that. So yes, payment, yes. The second question is a good one. I mean, it's the same thing down here. We're right in the middle of the Great Lakes, and yet every summer we have water use restrictions because we over extract from the groundwater, partly because of what I showed you before. Like we have stormwater mismanagement systems that have the water run away. Every spring when we have the snow melts, rather than having most of that snow melt go through spongy cities, it just runs off and it ends up in Lake Ontario. So it's partly, I think there needs to be some kind of, in your particular case, there needs to be, let's call it a environmental impact assessment or a social impact assessment, a user's assessment of not of the endowment, right? So you've got a lake, but that lake sits above an aquifer. What do you know about that aquifer? My wife and I, in our house in Nova Scotia, sadly spent $32,000 drilling 3 wells before we found water for our rural home. And we didn't drill that far apart. So how the seams run and all of that. So, so we need, an empirical basis to understand what is the endowment. Okay, that's one. And then 2, I think you make a good point about, we tend to think that it's only recently that legal systems have included groundwater in sort of municipal decision making or district decision making. If you drilled your own well, it was your own supply, but you're actually drawing off from a grid, right? And you need to figure out, your neighbors might not want it known, but maybe some of them are really drawing heavily off of that water table and causing a lot of I don't know if they're growing potatoes or what they're growing there, but potatoes are water, they're efficient in terms of water productivity. You get a lot of biomass per water, but they are water heavy. And then, of course, what you've drawn off, it also depends on the systems. Are these sprinkler systems? How much is evaporating, and so on and so forth. So I would simply suggest that there needs to be some kind of a forum. I mean, a non-confrontational, open, no zero-sum game, win-lose kind of legislated system, but a stakeholder forum where people get together and have a conversation about and bring in the relevant actors who can do the measures for you. You might even reach out to the Water Institute down here. We've got no shortage of people who can measure whatever you need measured. But that's the way to begin. It's to have a conversation, to do a baseline study, to try to understand everybody else's issues and interests, maybe your needs are 1/1000th of your neighbor's needs, but that should be on the table. Otherwise, you're going to have this kind of stable but what would you call it? It's a durable management system that only functions because it rains a lot.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your answer. I think we have time to go over the last questions. And it's a question from Bastian. And he just bring out a story from Germany, where they are currently having a big drought. They have only 50% of their precipitations. And over the last year, all of their water management care about flood control and the good ecological status, which is dictated by the European Water Framework Directive.
Yep.
And the question he has is, what are some additional large-scale measures that we can conduct to make sure that we got enough water for the agricultures and infrastructures in the future? I think that he thinks that we already hit our maximum possible of reservoir.
Okay. Thank you, Bastian, for that question. Of course, like all water questions, it's very complicated. But I think it's you've raised some really important questions. Again, it's no, you're talking scale in terms of Germany, which is different than the scale that Professor Evans was talking about around his particular lake and watershed. But it's not. But there's a kind of water is specific, but it's specific to the location. But there are also general kinds of things that we understand about how that system functions in order to make more water out of what the current endowment is. Okay, so this is what I would suggest. Now, and I know Germany has made, I work with the Bonn International Center of Conversion regularly. They're a partner in my Boomerang Effect project. One one thing Germany does very well across all states in Germany is closed circuit systems. Okay, so heating systems, for example. So unlike Southern Ontario, when you have new suburban settlements, oftentimes these homes are fitted out with a closed loop water heated system, right? Using, getting your heating needs, linked to solar and maybe some geothermal and so on, getting your heating needs through limited amounts of water. It's a fantastic system. Also, the way the highway systems are organized to ensure that oil spills and whatnot do not impact groundwater systems, and so there's a lot being done already. Okay, that's a point that should be made. But then moving forward, you can make more water, even when you can make more water from the water that you have. What I mean is, in urban systems, you can focus on demand management as much as you can on supply management. Now, we oftentimes focus on supply management because it's politically attractive, especially in the global south. When you build a pipeline, the ruling party likes to put its symbol along that pipeline and say, look, your water security is brought to you by the ruling party. It's a one-off thing. There's always bankers who are willing to support it and so on. It's an easy go-to thing. But the hard one is demand management. And, exposing Cape Town's, in the Cape Town case, if you take example, the supply management was overwhelmingly reliant on dams, right? Dams aren't the answer if it's not raining. They were very good at demand management, meaning that, looking at leak detection. So how much water is actually in the supply system, and then how much water is billed for at the end of the day. And so that variance will tell you how much water is just leaking out, or how much water has been pirated off by somebody else. So, so you can, through leak detection technology is very easy, simple to use. You can close that system. So the water that you have, you can make more of it. You can have it on tap, right? Then, of course, there's all the other stuff that we all are very familiar with, retrofitting homes with low flow systems and so on and so forth. There's redesign, urban redesign. There's a lot, So if you're going to be, if you want to do, especially in coastal areas, what you want to do is you want to discourage runoff and encourage infiltration in urban settings. And so what you need to do is you need to soften all of your surfaces. You need to put in urban parks. You need to, these are well-known things, and many German and European communities are already engaged in these kinds of activities. But they're ideas that you in fact can take to your own city council and say, look, rather than have this cement space here, why don't we plant some trees, make a park, and so on and so forth. These are additive, right? These are not. It's like, I think that individual activities can have and small scale activities have an additive, a cumulative effect that is better for everybody. There's no doubt about it. There's lots of other things we can talk about. There's big agriculture across Germany, across Europe, is the main water user. It uses 80% of all of the water that's been reticulated through the system is used in irrigation. So how efficient are those irrigation systems? We're back to price. What kind of prices are farmers paying, and so on. So whether there's an analysis been done across the system, and in the Cape Town case again, farmers donated I think it was 10% of their water allocation to the city of Cape Town in return for incentives, lessened pricing from the government and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things to be done. It's a big problem. I tell my students that the problems are massive, and that's a good thing, because you'll never lack for something to do, and there's always something positive to be done. So, and at the end of the day, I'm sad to say, the rain returns, and then we tend to forget that we had a problem in the first place. So the time to act is during a drought. Water policy people say that you should never waste a good drought. The drought is when you can push politicians in a direction that they otherwise wouldn't move.
Awesome, thank you very much. We just got a last question from Phụng, who is a student from Vietnam. I just wonder if you could go ahead, give her a short answer. Sorry. So she thanked you for your lectures, and she just want to ask you about using pairwise comparison method, ASP, to determine the weight of criteria without analyzing water quality by testing samples. And she thinks that this method is just concentrated on mining objectives. So she just wonder if you could elaborate about this.
Right. So actually, I think this is a question for Beata. So I think I recommend that she write to Professor Escher from the first lecture, because that is a perfect question to bring Beata back into the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So I will transfer the email of Professor Escher to Phụng Nguyễn, the student. So. Yeah. Thank you very much again for this very interesting talk and for this discussion you have with our student. We hope to have you involved again in our future events, of course. Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to everybody who have attended the lectures.
Right. Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable, and I'll be watching next week.
Awesome. Thank you.